So thank you everyone for joining us for our third and final keynote. This is presented by Dr. Carola Schenone, who is the Ramon Breeden Senior Research Associate Professor of Commerce at the McIntire School of Commerce at the beautiful University of Virginia in Charlottesville. Dr. Shenone's research interests are at the intersection of empirical corporate finance and empirical industrial organization. She studies common ownership, product market competition, monopoly rents, etc. Her work has earned a number of major awards and has been cited in public policy documents from Congress, the Department of Justice, the UK Competition and Markets Authority, the European Commission, etc. And she's regularly featured in The Economist, Financial Times, and Bloomberg View, among other outlets. I think Anna's presentation on the previous panel is a nice segue to what we'll be talking about now, which is more about common ownership, sort of the state of play, particularly in the empirical research in financial economics, which is a nice intersection with our competition issues we've been talking about today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Carola.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me. I wish I could be there in person, but things are hard. So I appreciate the opportunity to be able to join via Zoom. Thanks again for the invitation. So what I would like to do today is give you a little bit of an overview of where I think the literature in common ownership is, and what are the things that are future outlets for work in this field. So let's start from the beginning.
I think you might be muted now, Carola. Sorry, Carola, I think you're muted at the moment. Oh, there we go.
Can you hear me now? Okay, perfect. So let's step a little bit back and say, well, where this whole debate of common ownership started. And what has been the thing that's been going on is that there has been an increased participation of institutional investors in the public equity market. Institutional investors have increased their equity trades from 33% in the 80s to over 60% in 2018, and that number continues to grow. And what the literature has kind of focused on are a lot of the benefits that occur because we have this increased participation. Specifically for individual investors like you and me, what we observe is that we have access to a broader set of asset classes and well-diversified portfolios at much lower cost than we could otherwise have. For institutions, what we see is they gain economies of scale and they can offer these well-diversified portfolios at a lower cost, attract more assets under management, and gain more fees. So the benefits seem to be kind of clear. Now, the cost, that is where we wonder, what are the costs of having this increased participation? And this is where the big debate starts. And the question that has been raised is the following. Do institutional investors who own equity in product market rivals induce or even mandate that these rivals engage in some kind of collusive behavior? So let's just make it very, plain and clear. So you have an institution, say Vanguard, that owns an equity stake in United Airlines and American Airlines. And so because they own both firms, the institution might be able to call these firms, engage these firms and say, hey, you guys, why don't you just stop competing aggressively? Don't start a price war. Maybe just start behaving in a more collusive way. Because then, you're going to increase your profits and that's going to be good for me. So guys, just be collaborative. So the work by Asar, Schmaltz, and Techwood 2018 in the Journal of Finance, I was very provocative and kind of found what they claim evidence that institutional investors do, in fact, mandate or enable these product market rival firms within the institution's portfolio to engage in collusive behavior. And hence what they show is more common ownership, higher product market prices. And in particular, they do it for the airline industry. That result was very provocative. It started a big debate. I'm part of that debate. I'm a bit of on the other side, in where I think some work that I have done with Dennis Girardi and myself, we show we don't see that. We don't see that increased common ownership actually leads or causes increased higher product market prices. There has been some work by Lewin and Laurie that say, there's identification issues. Empirically, we can't really identify whether increased common ownership actually leads to higher product market prices. And the identification strategies that have been used in the past, mainly the merger of financial institutions, it's not really such a good identification strategy because it all coincides with the financial crisis and how firms that survived the financial crisis were kind of firms that were better off and doing better. So there's a lot of controversy here. At the same time that this is happening, there has been a flurry of empirical and theoretical work that has been debating the merits of this anti-competitive effect of common ownership. And in this time that I have, I don't have, I can't do justice to all of the papers that have been out there. And I must say, it's an increasing literature. People have started looking at venture capital and the effects of common ownership. In the terms of venture capital, people have looked at research and development, firm investments, productivity. So there's an array of outcomes that people have been looking at. And as I said, this literature is just simply growing. The empirical debate has sparked a lot of controversy and has led to some practitioners to come up with some really creative ideas. If it is true that increased common ownership leads to higher product market prices, then something's got to happen, right? We need to get the antitrust authorities to come into play and stop this kind of collusive monopoly power. And so proposals have been very prominent. And one of the things is, for example, we need to limit institutional investors' ownership of firms within an industry, or we have to apply with really strong force Act 7 of the Clayton Act. So Section 7 of the Clayton Act that would limit institutional investors. Investigations have been going on in the Department of Justice, in the antitrust authorities. And so this has kind of become a really big deal. And what I would like to say is the consequences of implementing some of these proposals are really, serious. They're really big, especially in financial markets. It essentially would distort the incentives of these institutional investors. Index funds would have to split. Retail investors like you and me, we won't be able to access those well-diversified portfolios at lower cost. Institutions might move towards a more passive corporate governance. They don't want to be involved with the firms because they could be, held liable for antitrust reasons. There would be a lot of monitoring costs that would be very onerous for both the firms and the institutional investors, right? And for regulators to monitor that, for example, no institution owns more than 1% of the industry. Then, you kind of constantly have to monitor that because that value of 1% is going to be changing over time. So you kind of have a constant permanent monitoring. So before we kind of jump into those proposals, it's going to let's take a step back and see what the merits really are about this common ownership hypothesis. So this is what I plan to do for the next few minutes. I'm going to give you a little bit of the theoretical background, the foundations, and the reason I want to do that is because we really want to focus on the assumptions of these theories, because the theories are just mathematical, facts, if you like, but do they really have any, resemblance to what happens in the real world? So those assumptions lead to a conclusion. Yes, let's talk about those assumptions. Do we actually buy those assumptions? Because if not, then the following math that follows from those assumptions, well, we kind of want to question that. I'm going to talk a little bit about measuring common ownership and about this very popular measure that pretty much everybody knows, the modified Herfindahl index or MHI delta, and how to take that theoretical measure to the data. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the channels. How is it that institutions can exert that kind of power and control over the product market rivals? So how is it exactly that they get these firms to collude? And I think that's a really interesting question. And to be honest, I think the jury on that is really out. I don't think we have pinned down a clear mechanism for this to happen. Okay, so what's the theory? How did this whole thing start? Okay, theory papers by Rubinstein and Yari and Rothenberg in the mid-'80s have been a little bit overlooked, but this is really where the common ownership theoretical underpinnings are. So in the models of Rubinstein and Yari, for example, you have shareholders that are the same as managers. They're interchangeable. They're the same person. And they only trade in the capital markets because what they want to do is maximize the industry profits. So shareholders and managers are the same, and they maximize the value of an industry. And then they trade in the capital markets to reallocate the wealth or the value of this huge industry. Rothenberg says a little bit different, says, hey, no, that's not the reason why investors trade in the capital markets. Investors trade in the capital markets not to maximize the value of the firm, but to attain a well-diversified portfolio and get the best risk-return trade-off. In this context, managers are going to be looking at, and note here carefully, looking at maximizing the return on the shareholder's portfolio in proportion to each owner's stake in the firm. So keep that really in your minds. So again, what do managers do? They're looking at the portfolio of the firm's shareholders. Mind you, every shareholder might have a different portfolio. So what the manager is looking is at each one of those portfolios and getting the average return and trying to maximize the average return for all of the different investors' portfolios. This should already be raising some red flags. The literature continued with work by Bresnahan and Salub and O'Brien and Salub, and they have some theoretical work and some empirical work. Their theoretical work and also some empirical work looks mostly at cross ownership, which is not the same as common ownership. Cross ownership is the case in which a firm buys an equity stake in a product market rival. So say, for example, American Airlines buys shares in United Airlines. That's very different from saying Vanguard buys shares in American and Delta or American and United. That's very different, right? So here you have American buying shares in United. So then when American is thinking, okay, I'm going to maximize the value of the firm, part of that maximization problem includes maximizing the value of American's equity stake in United. And therefore, American will take into account United's profits because they own equity in United. That's the cross ownership. And it is in this context of cross ownership that Bresnahan and Salub developed the modified Herfindahl index or the MHHI delta. What the common ownership literature did is grab this measure and bring it into common ownership. I'm not really going to question that too much. There are some cases in which you can do this, but that's the origins of this measure. Then the literature kind of went dormant for a bit. And 2012, the provocative work of Jose Azar came up and said, hey, I want to revisit this idea of common ownership. And when he said is, shareholders and equity holders are different. They're not always the same people. We know that there's a separation of ownership and control. And what he starts his theoretical model assuming is that shareholders vote on every action the firm takes. And then the managers somehow aggregate those votes and implements the actions that are approved by the majority. And so in this context, the objective function of the manager, again, the results, turns out to come out as maximizing the weighted average of the shareholders' portfolio returns in proportion to how much equity each shareholder has in the current firm. So again, you can see the objective function in Azar, Bresnahan, Salub, and Rothenberg, they all kind of point out looking at each shareholder's portfolio returns. And a very important and very provocative result in Azar's theory is this common ownership trilemma. And it says that it is impossible to achieve these three outcomes at the same time. You cannot have complete portfolio diversification and have an alignment of interest between owners and managers and have perfect product market competition. Those three things, you can't get them jointly. You might get portfolio diversification and product market competition, but then you're going to sacrifice alignment of interest. You can get alignment of interest and competition, but then you're not going to get portfolio diversification. So that's a really provocative result and a very important one in José's paper. So I'm having, kind of taken you a little bit to the history of this common ownership literature. I want to point out what's the common denominator in this literature. And the common denominator is a departure from the manager's traditional objective function. So you've heard me said what managers now are doing is maximizing the return of investors' portfolio. That's not usually what we teach in corporate finance, right? What we're teaching is the job of the manager is to maximize the value of the firm. And in doing so, it's going to maximize shareholders' wealth. So the departure from this traditional objective function is a big deal. Another common denominator is that there are no conflicts of interest between managers and shareholders in these theories. You either make managers and shareholders be one and the same person, in which case there is no conflict of interest, or you just simply assume away any conflict of interest. You make the manager be a benevolent dictator that would actually do whatever is in the best interest of the shareholders. And another departure from traditional theory is that there is absolutely no asymmetric information between managers and owners. Of course, if the manager is a benevolent dictator that will just implement whatever the owner wants, while the manager has to know, there has to be perfect information. And, you might start wondering about these assumptions behind the theories, and it just really doesn't seem to be very realistic. We observe that the actions in the real world indicate that there is a conflict of interest between managers and shareholders. We observe that there is asymmetric information. Managers probably have more information about the firm than shareholders. They work in the firm, they run the firm, they do the things in the firm. So there is asymmetric information. In terms of, if you're thinking about institutional investors, what these theories are claiming is that the role of the institutional investor is to meddle into the operations of the firm. So the institutional investor's objective would be to dictate or, somehow tell the firms how to behave in the product market, get into the operations of the firm, and make these firms collude. Now, that doesn't seem to be what we're in the real world, right? Institutional investors cares about having assets under management and making more fees out of selling their products. So we don't see managers kind of really engaging in the daily operations of the firm. So there is a little bit of a disconnect. You can already, kind of see what some of the things that I'm saying in this idea that there are no conflicts of interest between managers and shareholders. Well, we know there's a whole corporate governance literature that has looked at creating the right contracts for managers to align the interest between managers and shareholders. So if managers and shareholders had the same interest and there was no asymmetric information and the manager was a benevolent dictator, then we would not have all this contract theory and we would not have all this debate about how to write the perfect corporate governance contract to align the incentives. The idea that managers are benevolent and kind of have a majority voting rule that they can implement to satisfy the desires of all of the distinct shareholders, that again seems to be a little bit implausible. We're economists, we talk about the hour impossibility theorem and the Condorcet paradox, and we know that it's going to be really hard, if not impossible, to actually aggregate the different votes and implement a majority rule. And the other thing that, again, kind of seems to be a big departure from reality is this idea that institutional investors are focusing on creating a collusive environment within an industry. Because institutional investors don't just own equity within one industry, they own a well-diversified portfolio, right? So they own equity in different firms that could, depend on the industry on which you're mandating a collusive agreement. So higher markups in one industry might actually create a negative effect on the holdings of the institution of other industries. Just very clearly, just to put an example. 2010, Q1, Vanguard owned equity in Exxon and in Chevron. And, if the mandate of Vanguard would be to Exxon and Chevron, hey, increase oil prices, I want you guys to collude and create more, profits by increasing this cooperative agreement on oil prices, well, that would have clearly a negative effect on American, Delta, JetBlue, in fact, all the airlines that are also part of Vanguard's portfolio. So that will increase jet fuel costs, it'll increase the cost of the airlines, and it'll make it harder for airlines to become profitable. And we can carry on and say, well, Vanguard also owns Procter & Gamble and, Colgate and Dell and Apple and IBM and a bunch of other firms. And executives maybe use the airlines to fly their people from one place to the other one. So if jet fuel costs are higher because you created a monopoly in the oil industry with Chevron and ExxonMobil, then Procter & Gamble will also have an adverse effect. So, again, if you look at the whole picture, you kind of start wondering whether those assumptions behind these theories of common ownership, kind of actually, are they realistic? Do we kind of buy it, if you like? Think about another case. Think about the case of the manager of Delta, for example. And I'm just using this just as examples, right? But what I observed in 2010 Q1 is that Vanguard owns all of the airlines listed in the graph: Alaska, American, Continental, Delta, Hawaiian, Southwest, United, all of these airlines. However, Jefferies only owns Delta and United. So think about what would happen next. Vanguard would approach the managers of Delta somehow by some mechanism and would say, hey, we would like you to cooperate and engage in a collusive agreement with all of the airlines that we own: Alaska, Southwest, Northwest, JET, all of them, right? So that could be Delta's mandate. But on the other hand, you have Jefferies, and Jefferies only owns United and Delta. So Jefferies would go and approach the managers of Delta and say, hey, we would like you to collude with United, but not with the other ones. With the other ones, you can compete. And so then you can have, State Street, BlackRock, and all of these institutional investors have a different portfolio of airlines. So what is the Delta manager going to do? It's going to satisfy the fiduciary duty to Vanguard or to Jefferies or to BlackRock? I mean, what is the manager going to do? There is no clear mandate for Delta's manager. So I think, this somehow brings a little bit into question some of those assumptions and how realistic they are. So having said that, let's, leave that aside and say, okay, we can cast some doubt on the reality of these assumptions, if you like, and let's just keep going. And let's move into looking at how do we measure common ownership? And this is where I want to devote a little bit of time as well, because I think it's a really important issue. Again, I mentioned before, the measure of common ownership that the literature has employed is this MHHI delta derived from Bresnahan and Salop. And it's a great measure for cross ownership. And theoretically, it's derived from the optimal conditions for maximizing the objective function for managers, which is a little bit different than the traditional bond, but let's take it. So this measure is just the result of that optimization problem. Now let's look at the ingredients that we need to take this measure to the data. So what is involved in this MHHI delta? And I'm not going to put the formula up there, but some of you might be very familiar with it. So there are 3 ingredients. The first one is market shares. Well, we can observe this, right? We can observe market shares for airlines or whatever in the industry you would like to. That is easily available. So no worries about market shares. The second ingredient is ownership. So who owns these firms, right? And how much do they own of the firm? And you might think, well, this is kind of easy. You can figure out who's the owner, who's the equity holder. And the answer is kind of yes for institutional investors, right? We know Form 13F. We can go and gather this information. To some extent, there might be some, data recording errors. It might be a little bit noisy, but it is available. You can actually get it. You cannot get this for retail investors. And you might say, well, that's not really a big issue because retail investors are more small. We can just simply ignore them. And that's kind of what the literature has done so far, empirically. Now, there's a concern with doing that. And there's a very nice paper about Bacchus et al., where they mentioned that this assumption of ignoring retail investors can actually lead to outcomes that are very weird. It could lead to outcomes such as United Airlines caring more about the profits of American Airlines than about its own profit, which is obviously something that we do not observe in the real world. So it's just really not realistic. So most of the literature has said, okay, ignore the retail guys. They're small. Who cares about them? They don't influence. Well, you could lead to some crazy outcomes like the one I mentioned. And, that's Bacchus et al. Paper 2019. It's a very nice paper. So we said ingredients for the HHI delta are market shares. We can get those. Ownership, we can try to kind of get those, especially for institutional investors. Now, the third and last ingredient would be to measure control. How does an institution control the managers of the product market rival firms? And measuring this control is going to be very problematic, right? That is where you start to see problems coming. So what are the 2 ways that institutions can control management? The corporate governance literature has pointed out to 2 different channels, if you would like. The first one is direct intervention, or as it's named by Hirschman in one of his early papers and a long time ago, it's by voice. So this could be communication between shareholders and managers, or discussions between shareholders and board members. These guys hang out together, they play golf, and, between rounds of golf, they can just, start talking and mentioning some things and giving suggestions, and they can have their little chitty chat. I'm just not going to be able to observe that as an empirical person trying to capture a measure of control. It could be that shareholders are voting to terminate underperforming management. We can see some of that. So maybe voting to terminate management is a way to exert control and a way to exert pressure and threat. Look, if you don't do what I want, I can just go and vote to terminate you. There's a question whether we can observe that in the real world, but you can see how voting can, be a big part of this direct channel of communication. The other channel through which institutions can actually influence managers in product market firms in the portfolio of institution would be through the threat of exit. And Alex Edmonds has a few papers on this, and there are other papers that have pointed out to this. And the idea is, look, I can vote with my feet. If I, as an institutional investor, if I, as a shareholder, do not like what I see the firm doing, I can always give the threat that I'm going to sell and exit. And, of course, that's a threat. Now, first of all, empirically, it is going to be really hard to measure the threat of exit. I might see a large exit, a large sell order, I would have to link that to some kind of like ex ante threat. You did not do what I wanted. That's why I sold. So there has to be a very clear identification. And that's going to be empirically very hard. And furthermore, for institutions, this threat of exit is not really very credible, right? Because institutions would like to, track an index. And that's kind of what they're doing. And that's the product they're selling. So you can't just freely go say, oh, I'm going to sell all my shares of American. Well, you're tracking an index. If those shares of American are in the index, I can't just sell it because that's going against the objective of the product I'm selling, right? The portfolio I'm building or benchmarking. So that threat of exit by institutions, again, becomes like a really bit tricky. So bottom line is what the literature has focused on is measuring control with votes. And this is what most people, when they're building their HHI delta, they say, well, I need that ingredient, the gammas, for the equation of HHI delta. And those gammas, I'm going to equate them to votes, how you vote, the number of votes you can have as an institution. Okay. So we look at votes. And, this comes from one of my papers. I went and delved really deeply into what these votes mean. And institutions have different categories, if you like, of how they vote. It could be that an institution has no voting rights on some shares that they own. So they own the share, but I have no voting right. It could be that I own the share, but I have shared voting rights. And it could be that I own the share and I have absolute power to vote on those shares. I have sole voting right. So either non-shared or sole voting right. So most of the literature has said, well, let's focus on measuring control using sole voting rights. Or maybe if you want, you can use sole plus shared voting rights. So the number of shares over which you have sole or shared voting rights. What I found is that this is problematic. These voting rights and these designations are very vague, and discussions with practitioners at the SEC have confirmed this because they say we don't really have a clear definition of what sole and shared and no voting rights really mean. And so looking at this over the data, we see that voting designations are inconsistent across time and even within an institution across time. So that we can see, for example, in 2005, quarter four, Vanguard owned a bunch of shares, and they had, up to that point, declared that they had absolute sole voting right on these shares. Something happened in 2005, quarter four, that made Vanguard shift and say, well, we have absolutely no voting right on these shares. So what happened in that year? What's the change? And talking to practitioners, they're like, well, nothing really happened. It's just that, they just decided to designate, the shares as having no voting right. Just click a different box on the forms that you find. We see State Street that does kind of the contrary, right? They had shares that they had designated as having no voting rights up to 2003, quarter four. And then after that, they decide that they have sole voting right in all these shares. So what happened? And again, there's really no resolution as to what these voting rights really mean and how you're going to use these voting rights. So the concern here is, how do we really want to take this, theoretically solid measure of, cross, or if you want to call it common ownership, into the data? It's not really clear cut that we can do that. And there have been other empirical papers, he and Huang, for example, and Gilji et al., that they have actually come up with ideas to measure common ownership using different things that is not the modified Herfindahl index. So, for example, the number of connections that you have in a market between firms that are commonly owned by the same institution. a lot of what other empirical papers have decided to do is say, well, forget the voting. And what we're going to say that you vote, you control what you own. So essentially, you are equating ownership with control. So in that formula, you're just saying, oh, the betas and the gammas are the same. The ownership and the control are the same. And if you think about the original theories, that kind of might make somehow sense. Because remember, those theories said there is no separation of ownership and control. Managers and shareholders are one and the same. So, that's kind of where some of these, empirical papers have drawn to say, well, let's just make ownership equal control. But again, there's no clear definition on how you vote. The other thing that has been pointed out with regards to control and how you exert control via your voting is, how feasible this is. And if you look at the stewardship team in different, institutions like Vanguard, BlackRock, and T. Rowe Price, so, these are large institutions and very reputable. Their stewardship team consists of somewhere between 10 and 20 people. And the shares that they own, portfolio firms, range from 9,000 to 14,000. So we're talking about, 20 stewardship employees looking on how to vote on 14,000 firms. So each one is on average looking at, policies and deciding how to vote on the policies for about 700 firms. And, that sounds like, there might not be doing, either a lot of investigation, or they might just be rubber stamping their vote, or they might just be following what an institution or what a consulting firm tells them to do. But again, if that's what they're doing, is that really how you're going to exert control? To exert control, you need to know what the operations of the firm are and what you're voting. If you're, farming that out, or you're just, simply voting according to what somebody says, are you really exerting that kind of control that would be needed to create this collusive agreement? So, again, kind of looking back at what are the measures, the empirical measures of control, there are two, again, the direct and indirect. The direct one is just communication. It's going to be really hard to observe. It's probably going to violate some antitrust laws. You're not going to get a smoking gun on that one. If you do, then that's golden. But it's going to be really hard. And then in the indirect measures, the threat of exit and voting with your feet, just, is again hard to identify and pin down empirically. So for the next few minutes, then let's address the big issue. And honestly, I think this is where the literature has a lot of work to do. Trying to understand what is the mechanism? How does the institutional investor actually mandate this, non-comparative, collusive, this comparative, competitive behavior? So let's delve into that. For an institutional investor to actually kind of exert this kind of influence and through some mechanism, the mechanism has to satisfy some basic criteria. First of all, it cannot violate antitrust laws. So, can't just have a conversation in which you agree to do this. If you are caught, you're violating antitrust law. So it has to be, it has to hold to these laws. And again, the other feature of this mechanism has to be that it is enforceable and self-regulating in the sense that once you get to this equilibrium, none of the parties has an incentive to deviate. So once you agree to collaborate, then you stick with that and you're not going to deviate. And you have no incentive to deviate. So first of all, you have no incentive to deviate and you won't deviate. And if you dare deviate, there's going to be a credible punishment for not respecting the collusive agreement, from, being a maverick and stepping out of the agreement. So let's try to consider a little bit these two channels that I said. There is an indirect and direct channel. Let's see how it goes. Again, the direct channel would represent these communications between owners and managers. It's going to be hard to enforce. That's going to be your smoking gun. There are some indirect channels that have been proposed, and there has been some really interesting work about exactly how it is maybe the lack of communication that can actually create the mechanism and the means by which these institutions would coordinate. So no, it's not about communicating. No, it's not about talking. It's precisely about not talking or not creating the incentives. And that's kind of, I think, where the argument that has a little bit more bite is. The idea that you can exert control via direct communication that, violates antitrust laws, but it's kind of more in line with the original theory papers. And some of actually the Azar's 2012 paper, that kind of the implied mechanism in these papers. The other indirect mechanism, and that's Anton et al. Has a very nice paper on this that is recently being published. What they're looking at is the idea that institutional investors are writing the contracts for managers of product market rival firms in such a way that they're letting these managers relax. They're letting the managers enjoy the quiet life. They're letting managers, kind of be complacent and let it be. And so, that could be a mechanism that, doesn't violate any antitrust law. And it might be very valid. So the next question would be, okay, is it incentive compatible? Is it the case that if you do this, then no manager would have an incentive to deviate and be a maverick and say, no, I'm actually going to undercut prices. I'm going to get more market shares and I'm going to be more profitable. So again, remember, the argument is I'm going to let managers be a little bit complacent. I'm going to let them enjoy the quiet life. I am not going to write contracts that has, very strong pay performance characteristics. I am just going to be more relaxed, and I am not going to motivate managers to be more productive, cut costs, and, engage in a competitive, interaction with product market rivals. I am just going to be kind of quiet, let it go, let managers enjoy their quiet life. And managers might say, hey, this is great for me. I kind of like that, because enjoying the quiet life, there's nothing wrong with that. That's kind of good. So let's do it. Now, what you have to think about carefully here is, okay, wait a sec. That kind of ignores that the market for corporate control is not strictly limited to the current shareholders. We know that firms that have greater agency costs are more likely to attract activist investors. They're more likely to become the target of takeovers. So a firm that is relaxed and saying, I'm not going to really worry too much about, improving productivity, improving efficiency. I am just going to maybe have higher cost. I can have higher prices, and that's going to be okay. Well, wait a minute. There could be a private equity firm, right? There could be an activist investor. There could be, an acquirer who might want to take the firm. And so even if current shareholders are incentivized to enjoy the quiet life, it might not be in the manager's best interest to enjoy the quiet life, right? It could be that the manager might have an incentive to deviate, become a maverick firm, become more efficient, lower cost, increase productivity, increase profitability, and get higher market shares. So, I think the jury is kind of still out on that particular mechanism. So, very, to conclude, I think I've walked you a little bit through the history of the origins of common ownership, where this idea came from, these original papers in the 80s. Then we have seen the increased participation in institutional investors, people kind of having more attention to, okay, what do these institutional investors do? Are they generating benefits? Are they generating any costs? What's the balance between these costs and benefits? There could be cost in terms of institutions generating anti-competitive behavior. let's go and investigate that. How do we do that? Well, it seems that, a popular way is to use this modified Herfindahl index and try to find correlations between product market prices and common ownership. And so a lot of the papers have kind of looked at those correlations. And again, I just want to stress that I'm talking about correlation, not causation, because one of the things where I think the jury is still out is two things. First, the exact mechanism through which this happens. And second, how do you actually identify that the effect of increased prices is caused by an increase in common ownership? And, I will point to Llewellyn and Laurie's paper on the JFE on this, that has very provocative results saying, there's a bunch of literature. They all have looked at some sort of mergers between institutional investors who have, created increased common ownership in some sort of exogenous way. And then we can use that to identify that the increase in product market prices is due to these increased in common ownership. And by the way, this increase in common ownership is exogenous. I think what Llewellyn and Laurie's paper is like, well, careful, not so fast. Maybe that identification strategy, looking at the merger of financial institutions, is not really a clean experiment. All of these mergers, happen at a time of the financial crisis, and the type of firms that were involved are the ones that are, per se more profitable. So identification, I think, is still out there. So again, mechanisms, how this happens, and how to identify this in the data. I think that's where it would be good to see the literature move forward. And with that, I am happy to take some questions.
No, thank you so much, Carola. That was incredible. We only got a couple of minutes. I thought I'd just tee up one and see if anybody else has thoughts quickly. Is there a 1 or 2 minute summary? Earlier on, you talked about mentioned research on private markets. So I'm thinking of venture capital and private equity. Do we know anything yet? I don't know how mature that literature is on what the dynamics might be like in those settings outside of the publics or large institutional investors.
So the paper I was referring to is a paper by Luke Taylor and some of his co-authors. I believe it's a JFE paper, pretty recent, maybe 2022 or 2023. And their focus is to say, well, maybe the environment where we can actually see the effects of common ownership is more not just in institutional investors, but maybe let's look at venture capitals. Right. These are guys that work more closely with the firms. And so the mechanism through which they could exert some kind of influence is more clear because the venture capital, owns different firms that might be in the same industry and the same, product market. And at the same time, they're in more direct contact with managers. So there is more likely to be an effect. And I think that's kind of what they find, some evidence that, yes, increased venture capital, has some impact on product market prices. But yeah, you're right. This is kind of a new paper. And so that's, I think that's where, if you're interested in looking at this, I think I would direct you to Luke Taylor's paper and some of his co-authors. Yeah,
not super helpful.
So I did not have time to, do justice to all of the empirical papers that are out there. There's lots of them that have looked at different outcome variables. The most popular one, if you think about Azar et al. Paper and, Dennis et al. And Kennedy et al., kind of these earlier papers, they all focused on the airline industry and they focused on institutional investors and they focused on ticket prices, right? But there have been studies done, for example, in the ready-to-eat cereal market. And there have been other, studies that have looked at not product market pricing, but maybe research and development, innovation, profitability, productivity. He and Huang has a paper in which they look at a bunch of things, outcome variables. I am working on an overview, if you like, of the common ownership literature, a critical overview of this literature for a review article that should be coming out, sometime maybe early next year. But yeah, I'm working on that. If you're interested in this, I have a draft. I'd be happy to share with you. And there we do go into more depth into the channels, the mechanism, the different papers, what the contribution of the different papers are, what the advantages and disadvantages are. That should be coming up hopefully pretty soon.
Yeah. Oh, the question from the audience was where is that article coming out? Is that the question, Anna? Yeah. What's the venue for the summary article or the overview article?
The overview article was requested by the Annual Review of Financial Economics.
Okay.
So I'm actually working on that. They asked me to work on that, and I am in the process of writing that up now. We should have an early draft available, maybe September, October, that we would be happy to distribute. We currently have a draft. If you want to look at it, you can look at it and give us comments. That would be great. But we're not circulating it right now. We're in the process of writing it.
Yeah. Well, I will follow up with you personally just on that, and then we can take it from there. Carola, this was tremendous. We are up on time and have to move to another panel, but I just want to thank you so much for joining us. And why don't we all thank Carola for taking the time?